He didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't chase fame. And she definitely didn't follow the rules. Kristen McMenamy was never the typical supermodel, and she never wanted to be. While the world celebrated polished beauty and predictable poses, Kristen showed up with ghostly features, shaved eyebrows, and a defiant energy that made everyone stop and stare. She didn't ask to be understood. She demanded to be seen. And somehow, in a world built on sameness, she made being different into something powerful. When Kristen first stepped into fashion in the late 80s, she was called too strange, too skinny, too bold. But instead of changing to fit the industry, she changed the industry around her. Her haunting stare and fierce presence turned her into a muse for some of the biggest designers in the world, Versace, Chanel, and Givenchy, to name a few. She walked runways like no one else. She didn't just model clothes, she told stories with her body, her silence, her strength. But behind the high fashion covers and the runway lights, there was always something more. A distance. A mystery. Kristen never craved the spotlight the way others did. And then, just as suddenly as she had risen, she was gone. No farewell. No big goodbye. Just silence. So why did Kristen McMenamy disappear at the height of her power? What was really going on behind those cold, captivating eyes? And what happened when the industry that once rejected her tried to bring her back? Her story isn't just about fashion, it's about rebellion, identity, and the quiet power of staying true to yourself. And as we follow her journey, you'll see that breaking the rules wasn't her downfall, it was the very reason she made fashion history. But what came after might surprise you. Long before she became a face that challenged the very idea of beauty, Kristen McMenamy was just a quiet girl growing up in Pennsylvania. She didn't have the classic features people expected from a model. Her beauty was sharp, raw, and unforgettable, but it wasn't the kind of look that got you scouted at the mall. Still, something about her stood out. She was tall, haunting, and carried herself with a kind of effortless edge. She never tried to fit in. And maybe that's why she was destined to stand out. In the late 80s, she arrived in the fashion world at a time when everything was big hair, big makeup, big personalities. Supermodels were supposed to be glamorous and smiling, with perfect curves and girl-next-door charm. Kristen was none of that. She didn't play the part. She didn't even seem to care. When photographers pointed a camera at her, she gave them something different, something quiet, confrontational, even uncomfortable. She wasn't there to please. She was there to provoke. At first, the industry didn't know what to do with her. She was labeled too weird, too serious, too unconventional. But slowly, the tide began to turn. Avant-garde designers started calling. Visionary photographers like Steven Meisel and Peter Lindbergh saw something in her that others had missed. She was real. She was fearless. She was art. And suddenly, the girl who had once been rejected for looking different became the standard for high fashion. Kristen shaved off her eyebrows. She wore looks others wouldn't dare. She stopped coloring her gray hair in her 30s, years before it was considered cool. She challenged every idea of what a woman in fashion was supposed to be. She was never trying to shock. She was just being herself. But in doing so, she made the whole industry stop and rethink everything it thought it knew. And yet, even as she reached the peak of her success, there was always a wall between Kristen and the spotlight. She rarely gave interviews. She avoided gossip columns. She never played the celebrity game. And then, without warning, she stepped away. No one knew why. But the fashion world had just begun to feel the weight of what it had lost. Kristen's sudden absence was never officially explained, and that made the silence even louder. Some assumed she had simply retired, done with the chaos of the fashion world. Others whispered darker theories, was it burnout, or something more personal? Behind closed doors, the people who worked with her said she had changed. Not in a dramatic way, but gradually, quietly. She stopped engaging backstage, avoided after-parties, and seemed more withdrawn with each passing season. It wasn't about ego. It was about survival. She had spent years being everything the industry didn't expect, and that took a toll. While other models were praised for fitting into trends, Kristen had to fight to stay true to herself. Every job, every campaign, came with pressure: tone it down, smile more, lose the gray, fix this, cover that. The same people who once celebrated her for being different now tried to mold her into something more palatable. It was like being embraced and erased at the same time. And then came the turning point. A major campaign she had agreed to, something creative, bold, and centered around individuality, slowly shifted. The original concept was stripped down. The raw, unedited images were replaced with glossy perfection. Her natural look was photoshopped into something younger, softer, less challenging. Kristen wasn't even asked. She only saw the final edits when they were released to the public. Her name was on the campaign, but her face wasn't really hers anymore. That betrayal hit hard. She had spent her career breaking rules, pushing back against narrow standards of beauty, and now she was being pulled back into the same system she thought she had outgrown. It wasn't just disappointing. It felt personal. Meanwhile, younger models were beginning to look up to her, calling her an icon, a pioneer. But Kristen didn't feel like one. She felt like a symbol that had been repackaged without permission. She was being celebrated in public, but silenced behind the scenes. That tension, between legacy and control, between image and truth, was growing. And while the fashion world kept calling her name, waiting for her to return, Kristen stayed quiet. Watching. Thinking. Planning. Because if she came back now, it wouldn't be to fit in. It would be to fight back. But what would that cost her this time? The offer came at a time when Kristen least expected it. A major fashion house, one that had once overlooked her, wanted her to be the face of their new campaign. But this wasn't just any campaign. They promised something different. Something raw, powerful, and unfiltered. They claimed they wanted the real Kristen. Not the polished version, not the retouched fantasy. Just her, gray hair, sharp cheekbones, and all the strength she'd earned with time. At first, she was skeptical. She'd heard these promises before. The industry had a habit of dressing up rebellion in just enough gloss to make it marketable. But this time felt different. The creative director spoke with passion about rewriting fashion's narrative, about honoring age, individuality, and truth. And deep down, Kristen wanted to believe them. She agreed, but on her terms. No retouching. No scripted smiles. No wardrobe that made her feel like a costume. She wasn't coming back to sell clothes. She was coming back to remind people that beauty doesn't have an expiration date. As the campaign started taking shape, Kristen felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. For once, it seemed like the industry might be ready to listen. But just days before the shoot, something shifted. The mood boards changed. The creative team changed. Suddenly, there were concerns about market appeal. Subtle suggestions started creeping in: maybe darken the gray, maybe soften the angles, maybe wear something a bit more youthful. The unspoken message was loud and clear: be different, but not too different. Be bold, but only if it sells. Kristen felt the old pressure creeping back like a shadow. This was supposed to be her moment. Her message. But once again, her image was being shaped by people who didn't really understand her. It wasn't about representation anymore, it was about reputation, branding, numbers. She stared at the call sheet in silence. Everything was moving forward. The stylists were booked. The location was set. The brand was expecting her to show up and play the part. But what they didn't know was that Kristen had already made a choice. And it wasn't the one they thought. In the quiet hours before the shoot, with the fashion world waiting, Kristen was preparing something else. Something no one saw coming. Something that could either shatter everything, or set her completely free, while the official campaign was quietly being assembled in the background, Kristen was working on something in secret. Just days before the scheduled shoot, she met with a young, underground photographer known for raw, documentary-style images, no lights, no filters, no edits. It was a risky move. The brand had exclusive rights over her appearance during this campaign window. Any outside shoot, especially one that went public, would be considered a breach of contract. But Kristen wasn't thinking about contracts. She was thinking about truth. The private shoot took place in a quiet, overgrown garden on the edge of the city. No stylists. No makeup team. Kristen wore a simple white slip and let her hair go wild. Every wrinkle, every scar, every inch of who she had become over the years was captured, honestly and without apology. The camera didn't just capture her face, it captured everything she had survived. Every fight, every silence, every time she chose not to conform. The shots weren't perfect. They weren't pretty in the traditional sense. But they were powerful. They were hers. The photographer, unaware of the brand deal, shared one of the images online the next day, just one. Kristen hadn't asked him to. She hadn't planned for it to go public yet. But within hours, the photo exploded across fashion blogs, social media, and press outlets. People weren't just reacting, they were waking up. The comments weren't about her age or her appearance. They were about courage. About change. About someone finally showing the reality that so many models, especially aging women, are forced to hide. And then, the call came. The brand was furious. The legal team accused her of violating their agreement. Meetings were cancelled. Flights were pulled. A quiet but clear message was sent to her agent: if Kristen didn't publicly distance herself from the photo, the campaign was dead. But Kristen refused. She didn't explain, she didn't apologize. Because something had shifted. This wasn't just about one shoot anymore, it was about control. Once again, they wanted her voice, but not her truth. They wanted her image, but not her reality. Then, the second twist hit harder than anyone expected. A former stylist, who had worked with Kristen during her early 90s campaigns, stepped forward and shared a story, an old one, but one that had never been told. Back then, Kristen had been quietly pushed out of a major campaign after refusing to lose more weight. The brand, which had praised her for being different, had ultimately caved to pressure from investors, pulling her from the shoot at the last minute and replacing her with a more conventional face. The stylist, tired of the hypocrisy, finally broke the silence. Suddenly, this wasn't just Kristen's fight anymore. It was a mirror held up to the entire fashion industry. Now Kristen was at the center of a storm she hadn't asked for, but maybe had always been meant to lead. The question wasn't whether she'd be welcomed back. It was whether she'd burn the entire system down before they had the chance. The headlines wouldn't stop. Kristen McMenamy wasn't just trending, she was setting fire to the very rules she'd once bent. Fashion insiders scrambled to make statements, some trying to support her, others trying to quietly erase their past involvement. The campaign that had promised authenticity was now buried, never officially cancelled, but frozen in silence. And Kristen? She didn't say a word. Not in interviews, not on social media. Instead, she let one more photo surface, one that no one had seen coming. It was taken years ago, before the fame, before the covers, before the pressure. Just Kristen, barefoot in a sunlit room, painting. Not posing. Not performing. Just creating. Alongside the photo was a handwritten caption: "Before they told me who to be, I already knew." That single image flipped the story again. This wasn't just about a supermodel standing up for herself. It was about reclaiming a version of herself that had been buried beneath years of compromise. Suddenly, young artists, writers, and creators began sharing their own stories of being edited, reshaped, or silenced. Kristen had accidentally started something larger, a quiet revolution. The industry was being called out in real time, not just by viewers, but by the very people it had long depended on to stay silent. And just as the momentum hit its peak, Kristen did something unexpected. She agreed to appear at a fashion summit, her first public appearance in nearly a decade. When she stepped onto the stage, there were no bright lights. No runway. Just a single chair, a microphone, and Kristen in a simple black suit. She didn't walk. She didn't perform. She just sat down and began to read. It wasn't a speech. It was a letter, one she had written to her younger self. In it, she apologized. Not for who she became, but for all the times she tried to shrink herself to fit. For every time she stayed silent when she should have spoken. For letting others define what made her valuable. And then she thanked that younger version, for being brave, for being strange, for refusing to quit. The room was silent when she finished. No flashbulbs. No standing ovation. Just stillness. But later, backstage, someone handed her a note from a girl in the audience. It read, "You didn't just model clothes. You modeled truth. And now I know I don't have to change to be enough." Kristen smiled. The industry hadn't changed overnight, but something had cracked. And no one saw what she was about to do next. Not even Kristen. After that night, Kristen McMenamy quietly returned to her life outside the spotlight. No interviews. No comeback tour. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. The letter to her younger self had said everything she had kept inside for decades. But something had shifted, not just in the fashion world, but in the people watching it. Her choice to walk away with dignity, to speak her truth without bitterness, struck a chord. She wasn't angry. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was simply choosing to be herself, fully and unapologetically. Fashion magazines that once ignored older women started featuring them more often. New models, of all shapes, ages, and backgrounds, began to speak out more boldly. Kristen didn't claim credit. She never wanted the spotlight for too long. But her influence echoed quietly, like a ripple that never stopped moving. And she kept creating, not for anyone else, but for herself. Art, photography, and even a small collection of poems, intimate reflections on womanhood, aging, and freedom, appeared online under her name. They weren't promoted, but they found their audience anyway. As for the fashion house that dropped her campaign, they moved on to newer faces and trendier slogans, but people hadn't forgotten. And maybe that was Kristen's quiet victory. She didn't destroy the system. She exposed its cracks. She reminded the world that beauty doesn't come from fitting in, it comes from standing firm, even when it's uncomfortable. In the end, Kristen McMenamy wasn't just a supermodel. She was a mirror. She reflected everything the industry feared: imperfection, truth, age, and strength. And she showed that sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is to stop performing and simply exist as she is. If there's one thing her story teaches us, it's this: real beauty doesn't shout. It doesn't beg for approval. It doesn't bend to be accepted. Real beauty, like Kristen, just stands there, quietly refusing to disappear. And in doing so, it changes everything.